Okay, welcome. Let's unpack this. We've got a stack of sources today that, well, they seem to pull in a few different directions at first glance.
That's right. We're looking at texts dealing with faith, some pretty significant challenges, deep mercy, and also this idea of being called, to something specific.
Yeah, the sources are excerpts from Acts about Paul's legal troubles.
And then that really pivotal moment in John's gospel between Jesus and Peter after the resurrection.
Right, and some powerful verses from Psalm 103.
And finally, a reflection piece that sort of helps tie some of these threads together.
So our mission here in this deep dive isn't just to summarize. We really want to dig into these texts.
Yeah, put them side by side, see what insights kind of bubble up.
Find those key nuggets of understanding they offer about getting through difficulties.
And finding restoration, maybe stepping into service. What can they tell us about, living out faith in the middle of messy realities?
Good question. So where do we start? Acts.
Let's set the scene there. Acts chapter 25. Paul is basically a prisoner under Roman guard in Caesarea.
Okay.
And the new governor, Festus, he's briefing King Agrippa and Bernice. He's trying to explain this pretty unusual case he inherited from Felix, the previous governor.
Right. Festus explains that when he first arrived in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders, they immediately pushed him to condemn Paul.
They definitely wanted him gone, no question.
But Festus brings up Roman protocol, doesn't he?
Exactly. He says, look, it's not our custom to just hand someone over. The accused has to face their accusers directly. They need a chance to defend themselves against the actual charges.
That basic due process. Sounds simple, but crucial here.
It is. That's why Festus didn't just cave to the pressure from the Jewish leaders.
Okay, so to follow the rules, Festus calls a hearing in Caesarea, like the next day.
Yeah, he sits on the tribunal. Paul is brought in. Everything seems set for a standard trial.
And this is where Festus gets, well, confused.
Right. It gets really interesting from his viewpoint. He says when the accusers finally stood up,
Yeah.
they didn't bring any of the criminal charges he was expecting. Nothing serious like rebellion or anything like that.
That detail really stands out. He was probably bracing for accusations of sedition, something politically relevant to Rome.
But the passage tells us the actual points of dispute were, to him, quite bizarre.
How does he put it? Something about...
He calls it their own superstition. And then, very specifically, about one Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive.
Wow. So the core issue wasn't crime, it was this resurrection claim.
Exactly. And you can feel Festus's bewilderment. He actually says he was at a loss how to investigate these questions.
Because it's completely outside his legal box, right?
Yeah.
It's religion, it's theology, it's life after death.
Totally. It wasn't about Roman law at all. So, because he's stuck, he asks Paul, hey, do you want to go to Jerusalem and be tried on these specific points there?
Which Paul, I imagine, saw as pretty dangerous. Or maybe just unproductive for getting a fair hearing on that particular issue.
Probably. So he makes a strategic move. He appeals to the emperor.
It's Caesar himself, the highest court.
He asks to be kept in custody until Caesar can decide. And Festus, well, he's bound by that appeal.
So he orders Paul held, waiting to be sent to Rome.
It's a fascinating moment. It shows that for the Romans, the problem with Paul wasn't really about breaking Roman law.
It was this deeply confusing religious argument centered entirely on whether Jesus was alive.
Yeah, it kind of unintentionally pushes the central claim of Christianity, the resurrection, right up to the highest level of the empire, even if only as a legal puzzle.
So faith meets the power structures, leads to unexpected conflict, and it all pivots on this claim. Jesus is alive. Okay. How do we then connect this kind of external trial?
Right, this political, legal pressure.
To something as personal as the conversation in John's gospel about love and calling?
Well, that's the shift, isn't it? From Paul facing Roman power, we go to this quiet, almost intimate scene by the Sea of Galilee.
After the resurrection, Jesus talking with Simon Peter.
And it's that really famous exchange. 3 times Jesus asks him,
Simon, son of John, do you love me? Right after they've had breakfast on the beach.
It feels so deliberate. 3 questions about love?
Kind of mirroring Peter's 3 denials just before the crucifixion. Seems impossible to miss that connection.
Right. And each time Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you.
Although the 3rd time, it says Peter was hurt, grieved by the repeated question. But he still insists, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you.
But notice what happens immediately after each affirmation. It's not just about feelings.
No, it's tied to action.
Immediately, Jesus gives him a command linked to service, to care. Feed my lambs, then tend my sheep. And finally, feed my sheep.
It's such a powerful link. Love for Christ translates directly into caring for his people.
And that reflection source we looked at really hammers this home.
Yeah, it points out how Jesus doesn't focus on Peter's massive failure, those denials.
Not at all. Instead, through these questions, he gently, lovingly brings Peter back. He restores him.
And recommissions him right then and there. It's not about condemnation.
It's an invitation back into service, and that service is fueled by this restored relationship, this restored love.
It really highlights how God's call doesn't necessarily wait until we're perfect. It often comes through restoration after we've messed up.
Exactly. And that call to feed his sheep, as the reflection puts it, it's about actively caring for others, especially those God puts in our path.
But the John passage doesn't stop there. There's a difficult part right after the commission.
Ah, yes. Jesus says something quite sobering to Peter.
Truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted.
But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Heavy words.
And John, the writer, explicitly tells us why Jesus said this.
Right, he adds that little note. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God.
So it connects Peter's future service, this calling, directly to suffering, sacrifice, even a martyr's death.
And after laying out that incredibly challenging future, Jesus just says 2 words.
Follow me.
Wow. So service that flows from love and restoration might actually lead down some very hard roads.
It sounds like it could mirror Paul's journey, too, eventually facing suffering for his beliefs. This feeding the sheep isn't painted as an easy job.
Definitely not. So you have these intense pressures, external, like Paul's trial, and internal, like Peter's restoration and difficult calling. How does Psalm 103 fit in?
Good question. Where does the psalm take us?
Well, I think Psalm 103 provides this essential, broader context amidst Paul's potential conflict rooted in the core Christian claim.
And Peter's deeply personal journey of restoration and demanding call.
The psalm gives us this incredible, sweeping view of God's character, his nature, and his actions.
It starts with that call to bless God, right? Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits.
Yeah, it's like an anchor. Remember who God is. Remember what he's done.
And then it just bursts into these descriptions of mercy and forgiveness.
Oh, absolutely. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him.
As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. Those images are just immense, complete forgiveness, boundless mercy.
And it doesn't just float there as a nice idea. It grounds this mercy in God's ultimate authority.
Right. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all.
His rule is total, over everything, even the angels, it says, who do his word, obeying the voice of his word.
So how does this connect back to Paul and Peter? The reflection piece helps here.
I think it does. It helps us see how these different threads weave together. Paul's trial, which hinges on asserting Jesus is alive, well, that's happening within the scope of God's sovereign rule mentioned in the psalm. And Peter's restoration after failure, his call to a service that might cost him dearly, that's only possible because of the kind of boundless mercy the psalm describes.
So it suggests that navigating the external stuff, like Paul's trial, and stepping into the internal callings, like Peter's.
It's all happening under the umbrella, you might say, of this powerful, merciful, ruling God described in the psalm.
And the reflection pulls it back to that practical command from Jesus to Peter.
Exactly. Our love for Christ, which itself is made possible by his mercy and restoration.
Gets expressed, gets lived out by caring for other people, by feeding his sheep.
Even when that service might involve sacrifice, just like Jesus forewarned Peter.
Okay, so let's try to bring these threads together as we wrap up this deep dive. We started with Paul.
Right. His trial before Roman officials. A situation that surprisingly boiled down to the legal system just not knowing what to do with the claim that Jesus was alive after being dead.
A very awkward spot for Festus. Then from that external pressure, we shifted
to that really intimate post-resurrection talk between Jesus and Peter. We saw profound restoration offered right after a major failure.
And that restoration led straight into a clear mission. Care for others, feed my lambs, tend my sheep.
But with that stark warning that this calling could involve real hardship down the road.
And kind of holding all of this together, the challenges, the calling, we looked at Psalm 103.
Yeah, that foundation of unshakable divine mercy and absolute sovereignty.
So these sources, though they come from different angles.
They really show us that faith involves navigating tough, real-world trials, like Paul faced.
And that God's mercy is big enough, powerful enough to restore us, even when we've failed significantly, like Peter.
And that being restored leads us outward into a call to love and serve others.
The reflection piece sums it up nicely, connecting that feeding the sheep idea not just as a duty, but as the natural outflow of loving Christ, even if it costs us.
It really brings it all together.
So what stands out most to you as we consider all this? Thinking about Paul's legal battles, Peter's journey, that huge backdrop of God's mercy.
Well, the reflection source poses a very direct challenge, doesn't it? It leaves you, the listener, with something quite practical to chew on.
Yeah, it pushes us to think. Considering the challenges, the mercy we've received, this call to care, what's maybe one concrete thing you could do?
One way you can respond to this idea of feeding his sheep, serving someone in need, maybe even today.
Something practical to take away and perhaps explore on your own.